The second technique to decide whether we should reject or accept the null hypothesis is the comparison of the estimated test statistic with the critical value. So when it comes to the z-score, we can use this table as a guidance. So, for example, for the significance level of 10%, if we have a negative tail test, if the estimated z-score is lower than negative 1.28, we say that the null hypothesis can be rejected and we should accept the alternative hypothesis. As for the positive tail test, if z-score is higher than 1.28, we reject the null hypothesis and say that the alternative hypothesis is true. And as for the two-tail test, we take the absolute value of the estimated z-score and compare it with 1.4645. If the estimated z-score is higher than this critical value, then we say that the null hypothesis should be rejected and the alternative hypothesis is true. As for the 5% significance level, we reject the null hypothesis in case of the negative tail test when the estimated z-score is below the critical value of 1.645. In case of the positive tail test, we reject the null hypothesis when the estimated z-score is above 1.645. And in case of the two-tail test, we will reject the null hypothesis when the absolute value of the estimated z-score is above 1.96. And as for the 1% significance level, the null hypothesis will be rejected in case of the negative tail test when the estimated z-score is below negative 2.33. We will reject the null hypothesis in case of the positive tail test when the estimated z-score is above 2.33. And as for the two-tail test, the null hypothesis will be rejected when z-score in the absolute terms is above 2.575. What you also need to know about is that there are two types of error when it comes to hypothesis testing. So type 1 error occurs if the researcher rejects the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative hypothesis, when in fact the null hypothesis is true. So in simple words, this error occurs when we reject the null hypothesis by mistake. So, or we can rephrase it, type 1 error occurs when we accept the alternative hypothesis when actually the null hypothesis is true. And here comes a better understanding of the significance level. The probability of committing this type of error is actually represented by the significance level, so 1%, 5%, and 10%. So when we choose the significance level, what we actually choose is the probability that we allow for committing this type of an error. And the second type of error occurs if the researcher accepts the null hypothesis when in fact it is true. So when we do not reject the null hypothesis, when it is actually should be rejected.